During the 19th century, affluent individuals in the American South established a highly lucrative economic framework centered around cotton exports. This essential crop, vital to the burgeoning industrial world, consistently increased in value, elevating the Southern economy to the fourth richest globally. However, this wealth was fundamentally supported by the enslavement of millions of Black Americans. The prosperity enjoyed by many wealthy Southerners was contingent upon the institution of slavery, which they were determined to defend at all costs. This intense commitment to slavery increasingly set the South at odds with their Northern counterparts, who began to view the institution with growing skepticism. Some radical voices in the North even initiated discussions regarding a nationwide prohibition or abolition of slavery, a prospect that instilled fear in the slave-dependent South. The preservation of slavery was a concern shared across all strata of Southern society. In fact, approximately 25% of white families in the South owned slaves, with even higher ownership rates in the Lower South. For these families, the end of slavery would spell economic disaster. Additionally, poorer Southerners opposed abolition vehemently, as slavery represented a barrier between them and the lowest rungs of Southern society. Moreover, white Southerners harbored widespread fears that the abolition of slavery could incite a catastrophic race war. Consequently, Northern anti-slavery sentiments were perceived not only as an economic threat, but also as a social affront and a potential catalyst for violence. Alarmingly, as opposition to slavery intensified in the North, the political influence of the South began to diminish. The influx of immigrants had resulted in a population surge in the North, which proportionately reduced Southern political representation. Furthermore, Northern industries, banks, and merchants increasingly dominated trade with the South, posing a significant threat to the agrarian economy of the region. Concerned Southerners began to articulate feelings of subservience to the North. In order to maintain their political dominance, the Southern states sought new allies and recognized the necessity of expanding slavery. As the United States moved westward, the South insisted that these newly acquired territories be open to the institution of slavery. This stance was met with strong opposition from Northerners, particularly the newly established Republican Party, which advocated for the containment of slavery within its existing boundaries in the South. Furthermore, Republicans aimed to hinder the return of escaped slaves to Southern territories. By the 1850s, many Southerners viewed the Republican Party as their arch-enemies, derogatorily labeling them as Black Republicans. In an era marked by deep-seated racism, this designation was considered one of the gravest insults. After years of negotiations and compromises, tensions escalated dramatically in Kansas, where the contentious issue of slavery was left to a local vote. Pro-slavery advocates from the South began migrating to Kansas with the goal of voting in favor of slavery's establishment in the territory. These individuals were soon met by anti-slavery Northerners, who had the opposite objective. The situation quickly devolved into violent confrontations, fueled by partisan newspapers that incited their respective audiences, leading to a series of escalating atrocities. This period became known as Bleeding Kansas. Amidst the intensifying conflict, a Northern abolitionist named John Brown emerged as a prominent figure. A fervent opponent of slavery, Brown sought to extend his efforts beyond Kansas and made a forceful attempt to incite a slave rebellion in Virginia in 1859. Although his plan ultimately resulted in his capture and execution, many Southerners perceived this radical abolitionism as a harbinger of impending racial chaos. Compounding Southern outrage, the Northern public celebrated Brown as a martyr rather than condemning him as a terrorist. As tensions mounted, Southerners felt increasingly threatened by the anti-slavery movements in the North, a sentiment that intensified with the Republican nomination of Abraham Lincoln for the presidency in 1860. For many years, the Republican Party was demonized in the South as it sought to legislate the abolition of slavery, which led to its perception as a fundamental threat to the Southern way of life. Supporters of the Republican Party were accused of committing heinous acts in Kansas and were seen as endorsing John Brown's alarming raid, making their presence in the White House unacceptable. Despite this, the Southern electorate, outnumbered, struggled to counter the Republican momentum. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected as the 16th President of the United States, a development that Southern voters regarded as a catastrophic outcome. Southerners feared that Lincoln and his supporters, often referred to as Black Republicans, would fill national offices with anti-slavery advocates, provoke catastrophic slave uprisings, devastate the Southern economy, and undermine Southern society. With the nation seemingly under the control of a perceived radical who had not garnered a single electoral vote in the South, opposing politicians asserted that the only way to ensure the honor, liberty, and safety of Southern whites was through secession. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union, citing the growing animosity from non-slave-holding states towards slavery and the election of a president whose views were deemed hostile to the institution. This action was soon followed by 6 other states from the Lower South, which collectively established the Confederate States of America in February 1861. A month later, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as president of a fractured nation. Wealthy Southerners argued that secession was a legitimate means to safeguard their slavery-dependent way of life. To quell any dissent against secession, opposition was suppressed, and the issue was not subjected to a popular vote. While most residents of the Lower South quickly aligned with the secessionist cause, regions in the Upper South, which were less reliant on slavery, exhibited reluctance to depart from the Union. These states unequivocally asserted that they would not tolerate any military action against their seceding neighbors. They believed the responsibility now lay with Lincoln. The incident that ignited this political tension into full-scale war was the confrontation at Fort Sumter. This island fortress in South Carolina, occupied by federal troops, was subjected to an informal siege by the newly established Confederate Army. As supplies dwindled, Lincoln declared his intention to resupply the fort. To the Confederacy, this act was seen as a violation of their sovereignty. In response, Confederate President Jefferson Davis deemed it necessary to demonstrate military strength. On April 12, 1861, hostilities commenced. With the onset of war, 4 additional states aligned with the Confederate cause. Nevertheless, the Confederacy faced significant disadvantages. In contrast to the Union's population of 20 million, the Confederacy had only 9 million residents, nearly 4 million of whom were enslaved individuals. Southern manufacturing capabilities were vastly inferior, with factories outnumbered 10 to 1 by those in the North, producing 15 times less iron, 38 times less coal, and 32 times fewer firearms. It was evident to Southern leaders that relying solely on military might would not secure their independence. However, the Confederacy initially regarded the North's apparent advantages with indifference. They were confident that European nations, particularly Britain and France, would intervene to safeguard their valuable cotton supplies. Inspired by the American revolutionaries, Confederate strategists believed that by prolonging the conflict, they could erode the morale of their adversaries and instigate political change. Meanwhile, they assumed that the martial capabilities of white Southerners would be sufficient to fend off the perceived weakness of the Northerners. They anticipated that victory was merely a matter of time, leading many Southern men to enlist in the Confederate Army for a multitude of interconnected reasons. After years of escalating tensions, numerous Confederates perceived that Northern encroachment posed a threat to vital elements of Southern society, including rural independence and the institution of slavery, which provided their families with a sense of freedom and stability. As local communities united in arms, many believed that their honor as men was contingent upon engaging in combat. Yet the ensuing 4 years would reveal little honor amidst the prevailing darkness. Following minor skirmishes with Northern forces during the summer of 1861, Confederate troops experienced their first significant encounter in July of that year near Manassas Junction, Virginia. During the fierce confrontation, General Thomas Jackson stood resolutely, earning the moniker Stonewall and averting a potential collapse of Confederate forces. The First Battle of Manassas, as it was referred to in the South, concluded with a Confederate victory. Yet it dispelled any notions that the conflict would be swift and devoid of bloodshed. As Union forces regrouped, the Confederacy dispersed its troops along the entire northern border, hoping that its smaller armies could support one another in the event of a Union offensive. This strategy, however, proved to be flawed. Union forces led by General Ulysses S. Grant triumphed over a smaller Confederate contingent at the Battle of Shiloh, and a series of Union victories in 1862 breached Confederate defenses in the West. Compounding the crisis, a Union fleet entered New Orleans, stripping the Confederacy of its largest city and seaport. In the Eastern Theater, the Confederacy faced near catastrophe when a Union army came perilously close to capturing the Confederate capital of Richmond. In response to this looming disaster, President Davis appointed General Robert E. Lee to oversee the city's defense. Lee quickly repelled the overly cautious Union forces in a series of victories, establishing himself as one of the most adept Confederate generals. In an effort to take the initiative, Lee initiated an invasion of Northern Territory in the autumn of 1862. He made the bold decision to divide his forces, leaving a portion under the command of Stonewall Jackson while he continued his advance northward. This decision nearly resulted in disaster when Lee's invasion plans unexpectedly fell into the possession of a nearby Union army that was more than twice his size. Fortunately, Northern commanders hesitated just long enough for Lee to consolidate the majority of his remaining forces near Sharpsburg, Maryland, where he intended to make his stand. The Battle of Sharpsburg commenced on September the 17th, 1862. Union troops launched a series of fragmented assaults against the Confederate lines, failing to capitalize on their significant numerical advantage. Nonetheless, Confederate forces struggled to maintain their position, facing staggering casualties in a center that was perilously close to collapse. As the fighting persisted throughout the day, the arrival of Southern reinforcements marked the conclusion of what would become the bloodiest day in American history. Tactically, the Battle of Sharpsburg ended in a stalemate. However, shortly after the conflict, Lee's battered forces were compelled to retreat into Confederate territory. The failure of Lee's invasion disheartened white Southerners and provided Abraham Lincoln with the assurance to announce his Emancipation Proclamation, which pledged to abolish slavery in the Confederacy. This proclamation resonated powerfully with the anti-slavery factions among the Confederacy's potential European allies, as neither Britain nor France would openly support slavery or Confederate independence. The South's most promising route to victory lay in tatters. Despite this grim international perspective, the Confederacy continued to thwart Northern efforts to conclude the war. In the West, Union forces led by Ulysses S. Grant advanced along the Mississippi River, but were hindered by the Confederate defenders at Vicksburg. In the East, Lee achieved victory against a larger Northern invasion force at Fredericksburg and secured a brilliant triumph at Chancellorsville. Though mourning the loss of Stonewall Jackson, Lee felt emboldened to initiate a new invasion of the North in the summer of 1863. In early June, Lee's forces advanced into Pennsylvania, initiating their offensive against the North. Riding high on recent victories, the Confederate troops exhibited a sense of confidence that bordered on arrogance. On July 1st near Gettysburg, their optimism was bolstered by a successful engagement against a smaller Union contingent. However, Lee miscalculated the strength of the Union forces in the vicinity and soon found himself outmatched in what would become the war's bloodiest confrontation. With Union troops entrenched on the heights south of Gettysburg, Lee sought to penetrate their lines and secure a decisive triumph. On July 2nd, Confederate forces engaged in fierce combat against the Union flanks, which faltered but did not collapse. In pursuit of a breakthrough, Lee directed his troops to focus on the Union Center on July 3rd. Yet this effort also ended in failure. Although he inflicted significant casualties on the Union, Lee's own forces suffered devastating losses, compelling him to retreat back into Confederate territory. The day following Lee's defeat at Gettysburg, Confederate forces at Vicksburg surrendered to General Grant, relinquishing control of the Mississippi River and effectively splitting the Confederacy in two. This defeat was particularly bitter, as Lee had declined to send reinforcements to the crumbling Western Theater, placing his hopes instead on his unsuccessful Northern invasion. The military situation for the Confederacy was becoming increasingly precarious. Meanwhile, the war's impact was felt beyond the front lines. A tightening Union blockade severely hindered Confederate attempts to export cotton, while Southern politicians resisted implementing urgently needed tax increases. Consequently, inflation spiraled out of control. The ongoing conflict also profoundly disrupted the institution of slavery, as numerous Black Americans seized the opportunity to claim their freedom. The Emancipation Proclamation invigorated the movement for freedom, while the challenges of cotton exportation and the maintenance of slavery intensified, leading to the disintegration of the Southern economy. The economic hardships were most acutely felt by the impoverished citizens of the South. With many men engaged in combat, Confederate women faced significant difficulties in providing for their families, resulting in widespread bread riots throughout the Confederacy. The situation was further aggravated by the imposition of an unpopular draft on white Southern men, alongside the requirement for struggling farms to surrender 10% of their harvests to Confederate authorities. Despite this, plantation owners frequently found ways to circumvent these regulations. Those affluent Southerners who had been the most vocal proponents of secession experienced the least adverse effects from its repercussions, a reality that did not escape the notice of many Confederates facing hardship. As morale dwindled, instances of desertion increased. Soldiers concerned for the welfare of their families sought to return to their farms. This ongoing depletion of manpower posed a significant challenge for the already outnumbered Southern forces. Some deserters even resorted to armed resistance against the Confederacy, engaging in guerrilla warfare within Confederate territory. Jefferson Davis endeavored to galvanize public support for the Confederacy. Yet for some Southerners, the war for independence began to appear as a misguided venture. In the autumn of 1863, the Confederacy came close to securing a pivotal victory in the challenging Western theater. A large Union army made the strategic error of splitting its forces, providing the Confederacy with a chance to defeat the outnumbered Northern troops individually. However, this opportunity was squandered by Confederate General Braxton Bragg, who, despite achieving a costly victory at Chickamauga, failed to leverage his position effectively. Union forces soon regrouped and inflicted severe losses on Bragg's troops during the subsequent Chattanooga campaign. For many in the South, the setbacks at Chickamauga and Chattanooga marked a significant turning point in the conflict. Following the battle, a Confederate general noted that the fervor of the Southern soldier was never again witnessed after Chickamauga. The remarkable vigor that had characterized him was lost forever. The inability to capitalize on their earlier success was a devastating blow to his aspirations for an independent South. As the prospect of military triumph gradually diminished, the South could only wish for the North to grow weary of the conflict before they did. Despite being outnumbered, Confederate forces continued to fight tenaciously. By this stage, the Union's numerical superiority was further enhanced by the enlistment of hundreds of thousands of black soldiers, whom the Confederates regarded with disdain. Confederate leaders refused to acknowledge black soldiers as equal fighters and frequently enslaved them upon capture. In retaliation, Lincoln halted prisoner exchanges with the South, resulting in countless Confederates being confined to deplorable POW camps for extended periods. With each passing day, both sides became increasingly inflexible. During the summer of 1864, several Union offensives in both the East and West posed a significant threat to the Confederacy's existence. In Georgia, General William T. Sherman advanced toward Atlanta, while Grant initiated his overland campaign in Virginia. Although Union casualties were exceedingly high, Confederates hoped that the Northern electorate would remove Lincoln from office in the 1864 election, paving the way for a new president who might be open to negotiating peace. However, as Sherman's forces captured Atlanta in the autumn of 1864, Lincoln's popularity surged, ensuring his re-election. The Confederacy's final hope for victory dissipated. As the brutal conflict continued, the South descended further into disorder. Following his capture of Atlanta, General Sherman launched a devastating campaign through Georgia that obliterated what remained of the Southern economy. Reports of Sherman's relentless advance instilled fear throughout the South, likely contributing to the increasing rates of desertion. A Confederate effort to outmaneuver Sherman's forces ultimately resulted in the destruction of one of the Confederacy's largest armies. The depletion of fertile agricultural land severely hindered the South's capacity to sustain its remaining military forces. For the Confederates, time was of the essence. In the Eastern Theater, although General Lee had inflicted significant losses on General Grant's advancing army in Virginia, his own troops had also suffered considerable damage. Unlike the Northern forces, these Confederate casualties could not be replenished. Outnumbered, the Confederate soldiers soon found themselves encircled in Petersburg, a crucial supply center for Richmond, the Confederate capital. After enduring months of trench warfare, Lee ultimately commanded his troops to evacuate both cities in the spring of 1865. The Southern defeat followed swiftly after Lee's withdrawal from Petersburg. Cornered outside the Appomattox courthouse by a larger Union force, Lee was compelled to surrender on April 9, 1865. Shortly thereafter, all other significant Confederate armies would also capitulate. The Confederacy's struggle for independence had concluded, yet the battle for its legacy was just beginning. From the onset of the conflict, many Confederates held the belief that secession and the maintenance of slavery were essential for safeguarding the status, security, and dignity of their families. Ironically, the war they waged ultimately dismantled the very society they sought to protect. As their familiar world crumbled around them, some Confederate soldiers intensified their commitment to their cause, perceiving their hardships as a result of Northern hostility. These sentiments persisted even as Confederate soldiers surrendered their arms and took humiliating oaths of loyalty to their Northern victors. In fact, they were further solidified. Following the Southern defeat, a Republican-led Northern government completed the dismantling of Southern slavery, granted voting rights to black men, and deployed occupation forces to ensure compliance from the South. To Northerners, this was a process of reconstruction. To white Southerners, however, it represented a profound degradation. With everything they had fought for seemingly disintegrating, the deep sense of shame experienced by many white Southerners transformed into anger. Some former Confederates were drawn to extremist groups such as the KKK. Although the South could not achieve victory in the war, it sought to prevail in the aftermath. As Northern troops gradually withdrew, the South violently reinstated discrimination across all societal levels, leading to the emergence of a revised narrative regarding the Civil War. In this retelling, the Confederacy's secession from the Union was framed not as an effort to maintain slavery, but as a noble endeavor to safeguard states' rights and to valiantly resist Northern oppression. This narrative resonated with many Southerners as it reflected their genuine motivations for fighting, while conveniently omitting the less honorable aspects of their cause. This perspective became the foundation upon which many in the South were educated. However, no singular narrative can encapsulate the entirety of the Confederate experience during the Civil War. Confederates were aware that their nation was established to uphold slavery, yet they also recognized that it promised to defend the only way of life they had ever known. Numerous Southerners fought for the Confederacy with enthusiasm, while some developed resentment, and others viewed their struggle in more personal terms. As the conflict drew to a close, many Southerners faced challenges in adapting to a reality that did not align with their preferences, striving to revert to the past. These Confederates were not heroes, but they were individuals, and it is essential to remember them as such. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to our channel to support the growth of our community.